Science education, fitness too. Molecular Mom's got it all for you.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for episode 6 of Molecular Mom. Today I'm going to be talking to you about inherited genetics, and not inherited genetics in what you typically would think of with a change in your DNA being inherited and passed down to your children, but changes to the DNA that don't affect the underlying sequence of the DNA. This is known as epigenetics. So typically when you think of a DNA change that's inherited, you think of a change to the actual underlying sequence. Say if you have a sequence of CAAGC, that there could be a change or genetic variation or mutation in that sequence, resulting instead of a CAA to a CCA. So the A is changed to a C. And so this particular change can either have no impact on the actual gene and the expression of the gene and the function of the gene, or it could have a dramatic impact on that particular gene itself and how it's expressed or how it functions. So that's typically what people think of when they think of an inherited genetic trait, that you're going to have a underlying change in the actual sequence of the DNA itself. But there are also heritable genetic changes that aren't due to the underlying sequence change, but they are due to changes in expression that don't involve change to the DNA sequence. And this is known as epigenetics. So just a little bit of background, just for your general understanding of DNA, and it's important to know how it's packed. So your DNA is a long double helix strand, and that DNA is then wound around what are called histone proteins. And so these histone proteins are then packed together to form chromatin, and that chromatin is then packed together to form that what most people have recognized as a chromosome, that is densely packed DNA. So that's the general packing of your DNA, and those histones are crucial to proper packing. So there's actually changes that can occur on the DNA itself. Typically this is methylation. It's a modification to the DNA, the bases, and this can cause silencing of the genes. And I'll explain that a little bit here in a minute. But there are also epigenetic changes or marks that aren't necessarily on the DNA themselves, but are on these core histone proteins. So these histone proteins that the DNA is wound around, have tails of them, their own tails, and those tails can also be modified. So there's marks or changes, chemical changes on those tails, just like there are chemical changes that can occur to the DNA itself. And so these different changes, there's many different changes that we're aware of to the DNA and the histone tails. The histone tails have methylation, acetylation, ubiquitination, phosphorylation, and there's many other modifications that have been recognized to these histone tails. So you can have epigenetic marks that can be on the DNA itself or on these histone tails. And so why is this important? Well, this is important because it affects gene expression. So for example, just looking at two of the well-studied epigenetic marks, methylation and acetylation. So methylation, it results in gene silencing. So when you have a methyl mark, it causes the histones, the methyl mark on these histone tails, the histones then pack together very tightly. So when these are packed together very tightly, it's difficult for the gene to be expressed because the transcriptional proteins that need to access the DNA in order to express the genes can't have access because the DNA is just compact too tightly. So acetylation is actually a mark that allows the DNA to loosen its packing. So the acetylation of these histone tails loosens the packing of the DNA, and so that allows the transcriptional machinery to access the DNA, the gene of interest, and that gene can then be expressed through the transcriptional machinery. So you can imagine that when there are changes to these epigenetic marks on your DNA or on the histone tails, that this can affect your gene expression pattern. So the more tightly compact again, that DNA is hard to read, and so that results in gene silencing. And then the easy to read DNA, that is more loosely packed, results in increase of gene expression. So we know that the epigenetics can affect the expression of DNA, but why do we care? Why do we care that there is regulation of gene expression through these epigenetic marks? Well, it's important because we know that it's involved in a lot of different diseases. So there are environmental factors, and there are also lifestyle factors that we know that can alter the genome through these epigenetic marks. So depending on maybe what you eat or what pollutants you are exposed to can change these epigenetic marks on your DNA and these histone tails, resulting in a change in gene expression. So either turning genes off or turning genes on, or increasing the expression or decreasing the expression. So some of the epigenetic marks that are heritable that can influence disease are, for example, we know that there have been several studies where famine can cause changes in these epigenetic marks. And so children that have been born to mothers that were under conditions of famine, they show that these children are at higher risk of schizophrenia, and they're at higher risk of coronary artery disease and also obesity. There are many other diseases that we know of as well that have important epigenetic components. So intellectual disability for one, there's Fragile X, Prader-Willi syndrome. There's a couple other intellectual disabilities that we know that gene expression due to epigenetic marks is important. Cancer is another one. So you can have oncogene activation in cancer due to epigenetic marks, or you can have tumor suppressor silencing, and that can lead to cancer. Autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis or lupus are two that also have ties to epigenetic marks. And neuropsychiatric disorders as well, such as autism or schizophrenia, like I had mentioned before, have epigenetic components to the disease pathology. So it's definitely a hot topic that a lot of research has been focusing on, especially in the last decade. We used to always think of just being the underlying genetic sequence that was important. Those changes were important, and they are important, but epigenetic changes are also heritable, and they are very important in disease. And so I hope that I was able to teach you a little bit about epigenetics today, and that you understand why it's important and why we should care about it, and that we should fund research to better understand diseases that are modified by these epigenetic marks. Thanks for tuning in. See you on our next episode.
Science education, fitness too. Molecular moms got it all for you.